the next series of panels and one lecture. The first one would be a kind of a talk, a very important topic on the economy, and this will be delivered by Muthasa, who is the chairman of the Advocata Institute, which is a think tank. Muthasa, all yours.
Good day to everyone, members of parliament, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the organizers to have invited me to speak today. I titled my presentation, Economic Crisis, How We Got Here and How We Get Out. I'm going to re-quote George Orwell quote, telling the truth is a revolutionary act, and that's what I'm hoping to do today. So let's understand what led to this crisis. First thing is we misallocated resources. In a market economy, the price mechanism is what signals a scarcity of a resource. Now, if you intervene with the market mechanism and try to fix prices, you will invariably lead to misallocation of resources. The first resource that we misallocated was credit. We interfered with the price of money. So we made money during the pandemic too cheap. Second thing is we artificially anchored the currency. You can see a complete straight line at 200, which was through moral suasion. It was not through the central bank supporting the currency, but they told dealers, thou shalt not convert currency at any price other than 200 rupees. So you made the currency cheaper than what it should have been. There was a significant adjustment in the currency where you saw the currency going from 200 rupees to 370. And what those two other lines near and rear are showing is a currency depreciation relative to a nominal basket of currencies, which include currencies like the euro, yen, Indian rupee, didn't have the same level of currency depreciation. The higher depreciation to the dollar was because of the stronger dollar. And what you are seeing, the other line which is turned real effective exchange rate, is to understand the competitiveness of your currency, because the inflation in Sri Lanka is significantly higher than all our trading partners. And you can see that the currency is actually on a real effective exchange rate appreciating. And it will continue to appreciate in the next few months because inflation is going to continue to be higher till towards the end of this year. So the other thing, energy is our biggest import. Over 20% of our imports are due to energy. We kept energy prices artificially low. So what this chart is showing is the price of energy over 20 years. And on real terms, the lines at the bottom show the price of energy came down over 20 years. So I've done a comparison with India, what energy is priced in India. And here this is mainly petrol and diesel. We were selling energy 40% cheaper than the retail price of energy in India. And this chart shows you where consumption was. So if you price a resource below what it should be priced at, you will invariably get high levels of consumption. If you look at the chart on the left, which is petrol consumption, and I compared it with a period in 2018 and 19, in the period leading up to last March, you can see that the line for both electricity and petrol is above what it was 4 years ago, which was a period that was not impacted with any crisis. So in spite of shortages, in spite of power cuts, consumption was off the charts. Again, one of the reasons is that you didn't allow the pricing mechanism to operate. And this shows you the electricity, the price of electricity. For over 10 years, we didn't adjust the price of electricity, but the cost was in excess of what it should have been. So basically, you were selling electricity at significant losses for over 10 years. This shows you milk powder. And you can see the blue line, again, because it was a control price, there is no change in the price. The blue line at the bottom shows you the world market price. And what's happening is it's an imported product. the price in the world market is going up, but we are not allowing the distributors in Sri Lanka to reprice. So what invariably happened is that they stopped importing. And if you remember, when the crisis first broke out, milk powder was one of the first items that basically there was a scarcity and shortage of. And this chart shows you from the end of the conflict what happened to the price of land. And you can see the price of land in the Colombo city has gone, Colombo district went up something like 300%. Okay, and the GDP was not growing at the same time. So what is happening is land basically, which is simply a real asset, a lot of resources and credit was flowing into land, and the land prices was going up instead of investing in productive assets. So the reduction in taxation was the second causal factor. And what this chart shows you is I did an index out of 100, and the top line shows the growth in nominal GDP. It is showing where the economy started growing after the end of the conflict. But you can see that both what's called primary expenditure, which is government expenditure without interest, and revenues simply didn't keep up with the growth of your economy. So either the faster growing areas of the economy were not being taxed, or there was a significant amount of tax leakage. And if you compare this towards GDP, we used to have something like 20% of GDP as revenues, which in 2021 came down to 8%. And this shows you that over a period of time, that because of the tax cuts that were enacted towards the end of 2019, the absolute amount of tax collection significantly came down. So it was a combination of economic contraction due to COVID and the tax policy changes enacted towards the end of 2019. This shows you Sri Lanka's tax collection relative to peer countries. A country at our level of development should have had tax to GDP of about 17%, but at its low point, it was as low as 8%. The third reason was a complete failure of institutions. This is a fairly complex chart, and I go back to the 1950s. What this chart is showing you is what is called a fiscal deficit. So the total length of the column shows as a percentage of GDP what our fiscal deficit was, and the smaller chart, the blue one, shows you what is called the primary deficit, which means revenue minus expenditure without interest. This is what every finance minister every year can control, because the interest expense is on inherited debt. The colors there shows you the colors of different political parties, and the message here is basically the most important institution that we have in government is the Ministry of Finance, and we don't have a full-time finance minister. That invariably it is either the president or the prime minister who is controlling the finance ministry. The finance minister is the most unpopular politician because he is trying to tax people and reduce spending. And this cannot be held by the leader of the party or the leader of the state because he has a different mandate. The second thing is the central bank is one of the most important institutions. It ensures the integrity of sound monetary policy. It was completely politicized. You can see that governors of central banks are making silly statements like money printing doesn't create inflation. This shows you these international sovereign bonds, or better known as Euro bonds. You can see that during March 2020, that there was a significant depreciation in the currency, in the value of these bonds in the international market. But we kept on denying it and saying that the market is wrong and we are good, and this is not a solvency crisis that Sri Lanka is facing, that it is a liquidity crisis, that COVID will end, tourism will come, and everything will get back to normal. But the market was signaling to us that we were not good for the money. Instead of being proactive and saying that we should restructure our debt in 2020, we kept waiting for 2 years. And you can see that we kept paying these international sovereign bonds. You can see the price has come down significantly and there is a recovery in the price. These are traded instruments in the international market, and I asked the question, who benefited from this? But they are connected parties who bought these instruments. You will never know who they are because you can't, even a government of Sri Lanka doesn't know who owns their bonds. But this is a question that is worth thinking about, whether this was a conscious decision to profit from. The next is the fertilizer story, and we saw the repercussions of it. The problem in Sri Lanka is policy is not dictated by those who know. Agricultural policy was not dictated by those who know, but it was dictated by various busybodies and charlatans who knew nothing about agriculture. So Sri Lanka's road to ruination was paved with good intentions, but with disastrous consequences. So we have a lot of high debt, and as of now, it is estimated to be close to 130% of GDP. And the difference here, what you need to understand is it is not only central government debt, it's public debt. And the public debt includes the debt of the state-owned enterprises and the debt of the central bank. This debt is issued in various ways. Some of it is issued under New York law, some of it is issued under Sri Lanka law, some of it is held by foreigners, some of it is held by Sri Lankans. This shows you the distribution of who owns what. And this shows you the external debt, which has become a contentious matter, because the middle part shows what are called the bilateral debt. And what the IMF wants us to do is to give financial assurances that this debt will be restructured. So since China owns 53% of the bilateral debt, they are above the 50% threshold for the IMF's lending in arrears program, and therefore we need them to give us assurances basically that they are willing to restructure their debt. The problem is that the letter that they gave us from the Exim Bank of China is not very clear about what those assurances are going to be. You can compare with the letter that we got from the Indians, which is much more clearer. So I'll just show you this graph, which shows you the addition to the debt. And you can see that last year, because of the large currency depreciation and about 50% of our debt, which was denominated in foreign currency, the huge increase in the debt that happened because of the depreciation. You got to understand what the debt is. As I showed you, the debt is, public debt is over 30 trillion. Right? This trillion is a very complicated number which most people will struggle to understand. In Sinhalese, it is Laksa Koti. So what has happened basically is until 1998, which was 50 years since independence, our total debt basically was only a mere 1 trillion rupees. Today our debt is 30 trillion. So every 2 months, we are adding close to 1 trillion to our debt. I go back to the number, 50 years since independence, we added 1 trillion. Every 2 months now, we are adding 1 trillion. Of course, it's not the same rupees because there's been significant currency depreciation, etc. But the debt is snowballing. It's out of control. So, in all metrics that you use in terms of the interest cost to debt, we are off the charts. It's above 6%. To give you an example, next year, this current year, the total interest expense is going to be 2 trillion rupees. That is what is estimated. And if you take it in terms of revenues, our debt to GDP is something like 130% and climbing. And if you take this metric, which shows you the debt is getting shorter and shorter in maturity. So it has to be refinanced in shorter and shorter period. And that's called the gross financing needs. We are close to 30%. As per the IMF program, we have to get it down to something like 13%. So our public debt is clearly unsustainable, and a restructuring will be warranted. And it will require both an external debt restructuring and a domestic debt restructuring. What does this debt restructuring mean? The maturities of these instruments will have to be extended. The coupon payments have to be reduced, which means like the interest cost will be reduced. And in some cases, the amount outstanding will also have to be reduced. Now, under the IMF program, what are the parameters? We have been to the IMF 16 times. IMF is it is not an orphan to Sri Lanka basically. It's a well-known entity. As far as I'm concerned, the IMF is the only game in town, and you go to the IMF when you're sick. Now sometimes when you're sick, the doctor gives you very strong medicine. The fact that you don't like the medicine doesn't mean that you quarrel with the doctor. These are the indicative targets under the IMF program that we will have to adhere to, and they are called performance criteria and indicative targets and institutional changes. There is no time for me to explain all of this, but there are a few things that I want to touch on. This is something, if you are going to take anything away from my presentation, this is the most important thing. This got gazetted on the 23rd of February, right? And according to the parliamentary procedure, that a bill will be out there for 2 weeks. It's 120 pages. I don't know how many of you will have the patience to read 120 pages, but in our most recent history, this is the most landmark piece of legislation. We must educate ourselves what it says and make sure that the legislature doesn't try to water it down. What this will do is make the central bank independent, which means no money printing. They cannot finance the government in the primary market. The IMF is predicting a significant contraction. Last year it was 8%, and this year it's about 3%. A very, very gradual recovery. And the literature is full of the concept of a lost decade, which means that I believe our crisis started ever since the Easter bombing in 2019, because our growth model, and I will show you, has been broken for a long time. And the lost decade is it will take a long time for us to recover, because there's a lot of firms in the economy that are already insolvent because of the stress from economic contraction and very high interest rates. And we don't have an insolvency law in this country. Resolution is going to be difficult. So don't expect a very quick recovery. The concept, one of the targets is the concept of a primary balance, which means your revenue minus expenditure without interest. It's what a finance minister can control. In a post-independence history, it's only 4 times that we ever achieved a primary balance surplus. A couple of times in the 1950s and the year 2017 and 18. And the best performance we ever did with the primary balance was 0.8% of GDP. Under the IMF program, we have to increase it to 2.3% of GDP. Remember, the best we ever did was 0.8% of GDP, and we have to do that within 3 years to 2.8% of GDP. In 2021, the primary balance deficit was 6% of GDP, and last year it was 4%. We have to swing it to 2.3% of GDP. What does this mean? So we have to, and the IMF has said that it has to be a fiscal consolidation through revenue. They don't have a serious issue with expenditure in total. Maybe there are questions of the priorities of expenditure, but the revenues have to be significantly increased. In 3 years' time, our revenues have to be increased more than 150%. And the problem with this 150% is your economy is contracting. So you can only you can collect a lot of taxes when your economy is growing because profits are higher, people spend on discretionary items. But when your economy is contracting, to increase your revenues by 150% is going to be a very, very challenging and arduous task. The positives of increasing taxation, as Professor Mick Moore says, in countries in which its citizens pay taxes, enjoy better governance. So they can tax 3 things: what you own, what you buy, and what you earn. So this chart shows you how we get revenues now. The point here is that over 76% of our revenues basically come from indirect taxation, which is a highly regressive tax. So the high income people in this country don't pay enough taxes. And from those people is where this extra taxation has to be collected. So this shows you how income is distributed in the economy. The top 10% of households in the country earn 36% of national income. The bottom 10% earn 1.6%, right? So you got to start collecting it from the top 10 or top 20% of the population. And this kind of shows you the deciles adjusted for inflation and wage growth of how income and expenditure is there. This is an estimate. And you can see that the top 10% basically still has a surplus of income over expenditure. But when you go down the list, in most other categories, the expenditure is exceeding their income. And probably what they're doing is they're drawing down their savings to meet the cost of living. Now, the problem with this current pay tax system, which has been very contentious, is the focus is basically on the tax-free threshold, which has been set at 100,000. But I feel the real issue is the tax brackets. And what the line in blue is showing is how fast it goes up to 36%. That is where the problem is, because every 500,000 rupees it increases by 6%. And there's a whole segment, especially the executive class in Sri Lanka, who are suddenly seeing a significant increase. And my sense is that these parameters might have to be adjusted going forward to make it a bit more fairer. Now, this chart shows you, adjusted for purchasing power parity, what those tax bands look like, and as you can see that it is too low. So, tax policy is who you can tax, right? But the problem with our tax policy is there are still, in spite of people like myself paying 36% marginal tax rate, there are still large number of people who are legally exempted from paying taxes. So if you work in the service industry and deliver your services overseas, you have zero tax. So a lot of the people in the IT industry and the knowledge process outsourcing industries who are earning over 1 million rupees a month don't pay zero taxes. Is that fair? There are BOI companies who got tax concessions long time ago. But the problem is there are no sunset clauses. They have got those tax concessions forever. So my argument is there are no agreements that are sacrosanct anymore. After you defaulted on your debt, every agreement should be relooked at. And the issue here is how we are going to distribute this adjustment. So I just want to show you an example of two companies, lubricant companies. One company which has a BOI agreement for life pays 15% selling the same product. Another company that doesn't have this agreement pays 30%. So how can you have two companies, same business, paying two different rates of taxes? And this shows you Sri Lanka's location. We have a fantastic geographic location. But look at the wrong things that governments over the years have done. This is the West Terminal, which was awarded to Adani. The south port of the harbour was built 10 years ago. Everybody knows it's a sure bet, right? Not only did they award the West Terminal without competitive bidding, but guess what? 25-year tax holiday. Some of us will not be around in 25 years when this tax holiday finishes. I question, is it fair? Hindustan Computers, I'm using Indian examples here because it was in the public domain, it was not intentional. 12-year tax holiday and another 5 years after that at 50% of the tax rate. How can that be fair? You know this guy, he made a lot of bad publicity recently. Guess what? At it again. This was in the newspapers. Wind power project. What this map is showing is they are going to award wind power without competitive tender. Look at the thing on the right. This is only 2 weeks ago. The Ceylon Electricity Board calls for international bidding for a mere 70 megawatts. Small plants, 5 megawatts distributed across the country. International tender bidding. They go and award they're trying to award 400 megawatts wind in the most best area in Sri Lanka. Look at that wind atlas where it shows you the rate. It is so propitious because of geography. You got a landmass between India and Sri Lanka where the sea breeze, you have very, very high wind resource. It's a unique geography. No competitive bidding. We don't know whether they were awarded tax holidays. So the message here I'm giving is this adjustment that will have to happen has to be fair. everybody has to share in it. You can't cherry pick and keep some people out. Because if they do, either the adjustment won't happen or the adjustment of some of us who are compliant and paying our taxes will be more. We are going to go into our 18th program. We are never going to complete it because the targets are too challenging, and there will be a 19th. The social market economy, which the president has promulgated, is the best system for Sri Lanka because the market system will allocate resources on scarce resources. But the social market economy has a social part and there is a welfare part, which means that you collect taxes and you redistribute in terms of education and healthcare so that nobody gets left behind. We should embrace this model. There is no local equivalent or alternate model. We have to export a lot. This shows you the performance of Vietnam, the significant improvement in exports that they have achieved over the last 20 years. And look what Sri Lanka has done. We import a lot. It has been assisted by remittances, but our export performance has been abysmal. We have to sell to the world. And it is contradictory to say that you can export and protect your local industries. It simply doesn't go together. We have to come out of this crisis by embracing the world. So I come to the last part of my presentation, and I'm pontificating here. Why did we falter? This chart shows you something the president also, I believe, mentioned in parliament or in one of his speeches, that we had the second highest GDP per capita after the Second World War to Japan. And I've compared a few countries and showing the performance of these countries on a per capita basis. And you can see clearly that Sri Lanka has significantly faltered. Our currency at the time of independence was 4 rupees 60 to the US dollar. Today it's 370. How did this happen? I just have one pontification or one theory where you may want to educate yourself on. This is a fascinating book to read, and it's very contextual to the current environment why nations fail.
Muthasa, you have 1 minute. I'm very sorry to remind you.
Yes. So what did they say basically is that you have extractive institutions, both political and economic institutions basically, that don't allow inclusive institutions to happen. I think Maitri spoke about the executive presidency, so did Richard. It is the ultimate extractive political institution, and that is why I also agree that we should abolish the executive presidency. I know I'm out of time, but I want to show you these couple of videos. Can you put it louder, please? Can you go back one slide and put it louder? Okay, I think it's not working. I will have to skip it. I was trying to demonstrate what Lee Kuan Yew said in his final speech about who you should elect into parliament and the type of people we have elected. And I also wanted to show his son talking about the amount of money that is required in politics. And he was alluding to what Maitri was talking about, that in Singapore, the amount of money that is required to be in politics is very low. I wanted to show a slide which I had prepared similar to what Maitri said. Colombo district is 700 square kilometers. It has 1.7 million voters. Ideally, that if we go to a small electoral system, the electorate will be about 35 square kilometers, and you will have about 120,000 voters. So the amount of money that you will need to be in politics is going to be a significantly smaller. So you don't have to be a rich man or a corrupt man or a woman to be in politics, that many people who want to serve the country can get into politics. The civil service has to be restored because Article 52 of the Constitution says that the secretaries will be under the direction and control of ministries, of the minister, and there is no permanent secretaries. So therefore, basically, they are the pawns of ministers, and you can't run an administrative service if you don't have competent people where you attract talented people. And the recovery, the economic recovery is going to be highly predicated based on a highly competent and capable state. And this is another challenge we are going to have, because our state machinery is bottom heavy, top light. I conclude and say history is not destiny, that we are, there is a way to build inclusive institutions, and we are in a catalytic point, that this is the time to do that. But in order to do that, you need to have knowledge of what's happening. So President Kennedy said the ignorance of one voter in a democracy is a very dangerous thing. And that is why I'm part of an organization called Advocata, which basically is trying to engage with 1 million young people between the ages of 16 and 35 and make them better understand economic literacy. I'm sorry, I have slightly exceeded my time. This clicker was not working and I couldn't see what I was presenting, but I hope I got my point across.